I'm really happy that our fourth and final speaker is here to speak to us. Last night about 8 o'clock, I think I got my last text message from her saying, well, they canceled that flight too. I might be able to get on another flight later at like around 11 o'clock, in which case she said, well, that would turn out to be a false alarm. I'm going to fly out at 5:45 this morning, which was this morning, from Washington, D.C. And she flew into St. Louis and then rented a car to drive down here to speak to us today. So I am absolutely delighted that I had her last on the program. Had she been first on the program this morning, it probably would have caused some problems. Ana Escobedo Cabral currently serves as a unit chief for stakeholder communications with the External Relations Division of the Inter-American Development Bank. Prior to joining the bank, though, and what we know her as mostly, she was appointed by President George W. Bush to serve as the 42nd Treasurer of the United States, where she dedicated a considerable amount of time working to further the nation's financial literacy efforts. And I in fact, had an assistant that worked under her come visit us here a couple years ago just to help us think about what we could do with respect to financial literacy. It was a big part of that particular administration's way to address some of the economic problems that existed among American families. Well, some of our faculty heard her speak at the Financial Planning Association meeting last fall down in San Antonio, and they all came back raving about her, and particularly the students that heard her speak were the ones that spoke the most highly of her, which is always exciting to me to have a student say anything positive about anybody that they hear speaking, because I know I never hear it said about anything that I do when I'm talking to them. But her prior work experience, she's been the Executive Staff Director for the United States Senate Republican Conference Task Force on Hispanic Affairs. Dare I say that they're probably looking for your help as I speak, as they continue to try to covet that particular part of our growing population. She served as the Deputy Staff Director for the U.S. Senate Committee on the Judiciary, President and CEO of the Hispanic Association on Corporate Responsibility, and Director of the Smithsonian Institution Center for Latino Initiatives. She received her Bachelor's of Arts degree in Poli-Sci from the University of California, Davis, a school I attended that did not get a degree from back in the day. Master's degree in Public Administration from Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government, and a law degree from George Mason University. Just adding on a little bit from talking to her on the phone, and I hope I don't mess this up too much, but I know that she is the daughter of a farm worker growing up in California, in the valleys of California, working her way not only through college to get a degree, but working her way through high school so that the family would have money in order to help them reach the goals that they have as a family. Many of us in this room, I will argue, have come from families where we're just one or two generations away from not that different of a life. And it certainly is part of what I do, and most of my faculty do, and most of us here in the room do, I think, as well, why we work in public education and why we believe that land-grant institutions and public institutions are so damn important, excuse my French, because they are the greatest equalizer that we have in this country. And not only do we have a great equalizer at the University of Missouri, but we have a great example of what education and hard work can in fact do for individuals. And so I offer you Ana Cabral.
So I had a PowerPoint, but I'm going to skip that. I'll share it with Robert afterwards, so if anybody's interested in a lot of slides, I'll share them with you post the remarks. I do have some numbers which I've jotted down and I've brought up with me. But I wanted to start by telling you that it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm really inspired by what Robert is doing here, what this department is doing, what this university is doing. It's an amazing thing. And he really intrigued me when he called me and said, we've been doing this is our 5th year, and we really believe in it, we practice it, and we make a difference in people's lives. because those are the kind of things that make me really inspired as well. So thank you for allowing me to come out here. It was really a pleasure. And now I know a little bit about Missouri. Never been here before other than to pass through an airport, and I want to come back. So I hope you'll let me do that. Not necessarily as a speaker, but certainly as a shopper. I'll add to the economy. So I want to, we titled this Financial Literacy 101 from a Past U.S. Treasurer, partly because we couldn't come up with a different topic. I was in the middle of a lot of stuff going on at work. But also because in some ways it's a little counterintuitive. And I say that to you because if you had any idea where I came from, where I grew up, you would never for a second imagine that I would have become the 42nd Treasurer of the United States. And even more so, you would be surprised that I knew anything at all about money. Now, I have to say, I was really impressed with Julie's presentation. I do hope to catch up with her and get some advice about investing myself. But I'm not necessarily an expert in, and I don't do financial planning for a living. That's not what I've been about. It's really been about the policy questions that happen in Washington, D.C., and how do we make a difference in people's lives every single day. And when I say you wouldn't have guessed that that would have been the case if you'd met me, say, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, it's because I grew up in a very, very poor home where no one knew anything about money. For generations, and I mean 4 of them, my family worked in the field. They came from Mexico very early on in life. They were trying to escape the violence of the Mexican Revolution. They came knowing a little bit about math. My grandparents, my great-grandparents were actually accountants. My great-grandfather was. But when he came here to the United States, he couldn't find work. So he worked in the fields. My grandparents joined him. My father's generation joined him. And even my generation joined him. I worked in the fields for a little while as well. My father decided that life in the fields wasn't good enough for his children. So he decided to change careers. And what he did is, without an education, he never graduated high school, neither did my mother. He used the only tools he had in life, and in his generation, you could still make a decent living using your hands and your back. So he got to work laboring. And he tried every possible combination of careers he could imagine. He worked once for a while in a mental institution, washing sheets for the patients. He drove a major big rig across the country. He eventually found his way to be a busboy and then taught himself to be a fry cook, and then he became a chef. Self-taught, never went to school, but he was very good at it. And the only problem with those jobs were that they required a great deal of physical strength and stamina, and he was actually a very small man in terms of frame and size. Big heart, but very small man in terms of health. And he had a lot of illnesses as a young boy, and so as a result, he ended up injuring his spine many times over the course of his lifetime. And at that time, when you ruptured a disc, they'd fuse your spine together, and they would immobilize it so that you could prevent any further damage to the spinal cord. But by the time I was entering my teens, my father had had the 4th in a series of operations to basically fuse sections of his spine together, so that at that point he was fused from the base of his neck to the bottom of his spine. They told him he'd never walk again. And he never gave up. He was a very strong and very persistent man, and so after spending probably more than a year in bed, he did finally get up out of that bed and walk and try to learn how to create a new living for his family because he could no longer work in restaurants. So he borrowed $100 and bought a pickup truck. And he became what I call a junker. So he would pick up metal trash on the curb, no matter what it was. It wasn't just the empty aluminum cans, it was washing machines, it was dryers, it was car parts. And my brothers and sisters and I would sit in the front yard and we would peel off the plastic of the wires inside the motors to try to figure out whether it was aluminum or copper, sort it so that we could sell it back. We survived on that. During the period of time where he couldn't work, we collected welfare. There was nothing else we could do. It was terribly embarrassing, it was very difficult. I remember standing in line. They give you a little coupon to go get school clothes. It was all used. You'd get a pair of underwear, a pair of shoes, a little jacket, a dress, etc. We also survived on government USD surplus food. I don't know if some of you are familiar with that. It was when they would give out the butter and the cheese, but they'd also give out boned chicken and whole wheat and lots of different things that my mother would make amazing meals with. But it was just very difficult as a teenager, the eldest of 5 children, who at this point had become very conscious of the world around her. And I remember I went to work both in my junior high years and in my high school years, mostly because we needed money. We had none. My mother had been mentally ill for many years and couldn't work, couldn't contribute. My father was just barely eking out a living. We survived on a couple $100s a month. We rented a tiny adobe home in the middle of nowhere in the desert so that we could survive. And I wanted a new dress. Sounds crazy, but as a young teenager, I just wanted a new dress. So I saved every penny I possibly could. And there was a dress store on my way home from my high school. I used to walk a couple miles back and forth along the railroad tracks, where I would stop every single day, every day. I'd walk in and I'd try this most beautiful pink dress on, stand in the mirror, imagine myself owning it, hang it back on the hanger, and walk out. Never bought it, never could. And on my way home, I'd walk along those railroad tracks, and don't tell anybody because it's probably stealing. I would pick up every piece of scrap metal along the tracks that I could. They look like railroad ties, you know those big giant nails? I'd fill my pockets up, everything I could possibly carry every single day, so that my dad would have a little more to throw into the pile so that we would be able to maybe get meat sometime that week. Now, I'll have to tell you personally, I've never seen him so happy as the day that I found a chain, probably about 15, 20 feet long, with links about this big, that took me an extra couple hours to drag home. I think it was probably more than 100 pounds. I never saw him so happy as that day. But he also said to me, you know, you probably ought to stop picking some of this stuff up because they're giving me funny looks at the metal yard. So I did. And I thought for a second what I should do is graduate early from high school. I was a really good student. I loved school. And go out and get a real job and make a difference in my family's life. And if it hadn't been for a high school teacher who intervened, that would have been the course of my life. And I'm not sure how it would have turned out. I'm sure I would have moved forward and upward. But this particular high school teacher called me to his office and he said, I want you to apply to college. I was a 16-year-old thinking I was going to go work for McDonald's, and here's this gentleman saying I should go to the University of California. I said to Mr. Lamb, it's impossible. Nobody in my family has ever gone to college, let alone graduated high school. We don't have the money, and my parents need me to work. And he insisted. He didn't give up. He pulled a college application out of the center of his desk drawer. He hand wrote my college application for me. Said, I'll be by to visit your parents this evening and explain why this is a better course for you and for your family long term. And he did exactly that. So after a while, he was able to convince my very strict, very traditional father to let his 16-year-old daughter travel several hundreds miles away to the University of California, Santa Cruz, a campus Mr. Lamb selected for me, very wisely, I'll tell you why in a second. And he turned in my college application. My father allowed me to go on the promise that Mr. Lamb would find scholarship dollars for me. And he did. Before I knew it, I was at the University of California, and I, for the first time in my life, though I'd felt embarrassed earlier in my youth, was now very angry. I was absolutely flooded with anger. It was amazing to me. Here's a place where lots of opportunities exist, but I now am in a place where I don't necessarily feel like I belong, but worse yet, I've left behind hundreds of people who were no different than me. I just got lucky. Mr. Lamb just made that extra effort and said, I'm going to change the course and direction of your life. But there were people who were just as bright, just as capable, who lived in the neighborhoods where we grew up, who didn't have that opportunity. They were repeating the mistakes of their parents, dying young of drugs, gangs, having children as children, going on to a cycle of welfare, low income, hopeless lives. And all they really needed was somebody to turn them a little bit in this direction and say, go get that education. Learn more about the opportunities. Your dreams can come true. So I decided that the gift that Mr. Lamb had given me, I needed to repay by finding ways to open up doors for other people. And I've tried to do that. Now, I'm not saying that life was hunky-dory after that. I mean, I really took some interesting turns, mostly because I didn't have anybody to turn to who could direct me. For example, I did go to Harvard, but I had 4 children who went with me. I dropped out of college in my 3rd year, at the end of it. I started having children, got married young. It all worked out really well. I have a fantastic husband. My best advice to young people is be careful who you marry. Very important decision. Make sure it's somebody who supports you, believes in you, is willing to go the extra mile. Best decision I ever made. But, as I say, there were challenges along the way. Most of them because I didn't have the kind of information available to me through my parents at my dinner table growing up about how you save for the future, how you plan, how you budget, how you pull things together. Why it's important to start saving in your first job and not wait until you've had several. Use compound interest to grow that balance sheet early. So, yeah, there were challenges, but they were wonderful experiences as well. Yes, I graduated from Harvard with $100,000 in debt. Yes, I'm glad I did it. It allowed me to have an opportunity to expose my children to a life they never would have known. It also allowed me to get great jobs afterwards. Would I recommend it to everybody? No. Would I recommend borrowing for education? Yes, make a sound decision. Best investment you will ever make. Best return on your investment. Those are the messages I try to convey to young people especially. But for my son and my daughters who attended Harvard classes with me, it was a real novelty. You know, my youngest at that point was 3. And he would have to go to class with me because I couldn't afford the daycare. So he'd sit alongside me. And when the professor at the end of the lecture would say, "Does anybody have a question?" he would raise his hand. I'd put it down, he'd raise it again. Eventually, the professor would say, what's your question, young man? And he would have a really intelligent question as a 3-year-old. No surprise, he ended up going to MIT studying nuclear engineering. I say to him most of the time, he's my retirement plan. I paid for that. It's half joking, because I don't want to be a burden on my children, right, in retirement. I'm working really hard at it. Now, I told you I didn't know how to put 2 nickels together because I never learned how. I got really lucky because I married somebody who did know how and taught me everything he knew. So very quickly, he taught me how to make a budget. I've been married 32 years. I have 32 years of budgets. I can tell you what I spent in the first year we married, and I can tell you what we spent last year. My husband is so disciplined that every year in December, we sit down and have a conference. He wants to know why we're still paying so much for electricity, or heat, or water, or why is the cable bill so high? Can't you do anything to lower that? And he would push very hard every single year. We'd look at the debt we were carrying then. Is there any money now at the end of the year that we can pay down some of that debt? Let's pay the higher interest debt first, and then so forth. Or sometimes let's just do a small win. This account I now owe just $300 on. Let's pay it off. Let's enjoy, let's be euphoric about one less debt, right? That was especially true when we were managing our student loans. But it was important to do. I really believe that Americans need to do annual financial checkups. Make it part of our discipline, our DNA. Don't we do health checkups annually? We've been convinced it's a really good idea, right? A physical exam. Do a financial exam every single year. Look for some help around that. When I went to the Department of Treasury, they asked me, well, what do you want to work on besides coin and currency design? We'd really like your help in financial literacy. And I said, okay, I'd love to do that because I learned a lot about how and why that's important. How do we help the average family? You know, it's interesting, but in this country still, there are millions of unbanked and underbanked families who pay very high fees for services that they shouldn't be paying fees for at all. My family was one of those, so I understand those fees. You know, there are opportunity costs, standing in line to pay your electricity bill before they shut it off or to reconnect, and now you've got a reconnection fee. Or the charges that come with money orders because you don't have an account. Or the inability to borrow or use a credit card because you don't have any credit history. Those still exist for many families in this country. Those are still the families that you're going to depend on when you retire to be making contributions to the Social Security system. They need to be sound financially. It's interesting, when we watched what happened with the housing bubble, and it was a very sad thing. Yes, I absolutely agree with Julie, there was a lot of greed involved. But it was also important, I think really illustrative of the fact that too many families just didn't know when a deal is too good to be true. You gotta walk away. When somebody says, I'm going to give you the keys to a house, probably 3, 4, 5, 6 times your annual salary, or 7, 8, 9, 10 times your annual salary, with no down payment, no credit check, no proof of income, you probably ought to be thinking, should I really be doing this? Isn't it too much house for me? Can I really make the payments going forward? But we all got wrapped into this society where we think everything goes up and nothing comes down. Every room in the house needs to have a big screen TV. Delayed gratification is not a concept any of us recognize anymore. You know, we buy everything on credit. I want it and I want it now. I don't need to save for that. I don't need to make sure I have enough cash in the bank. Should I really buy that depreciating asset over a possibly appreciating asset? Do I know how to make a budget? Do I know how to save for the future? Pay myself first. These are important lessons we should be having at the dining table with our children, as grandparents with our grandchildren. And if you don't have any of those, or even if you do, grab a few of your nieces and nephews and do the same with them. You know, this is the kind of thing where we all as individuals have the amazing power to make a difference in somebody else's life. Mr. Lamb touched my life in a way that is so incredible. You can't imagine the ripples that have come from that one action of his. And I don't even know about them. I find it's interesting that sometimes people will come to me afterwards and say, I heard you speak 10 years ago, and you inspired me to go to college. You inspired me to buy my first house. You inspired me to do this, that, or the other. And now my children are going to the university. We have no idea the impact of somebody's gift in their lives many generations forward. But we do have that power to touch those lives today. So I would encourage you to do that. Do it every single day. Make it real. You know, financial literacy is not just for the wealthy, and investing is not just for the well-off. And if we don't do a good job of making sure that we all make sound decisions, then when people buy more than they can afford, and they lose those homes to foreclosure, and the values of those homes come down, so does the neighborhood's value. When the neighborhood's value comes down, the tax revenue comes down. When the tax revenue comes down, services go down. It's a vicious cycle, and every single one of us pays the price. So it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that regardless of who you are, regardless of your income level, that you know how to make smart decisions, and that you have access to basic financial services, that you can count on, for example, a short-term loan in the form of a credit card instead of a payday lender, where annualized rates of interest can get up to 400%. It's crazy. One of the things we did at Treasury was we looked at those policy questions and we said, how do we make a difference? You know, there really isn't a national strategy, or there wasn't at the time, around financial literacy. How do we make everyone in the country well aware, prepared to make decisions? Well, we started to look at what was happening, and we created what we call a national strategy, and the GAO later said, that's not a national strategy. It's a nice assessment of what exists today, and a nice description of some of the things that are working, but it's not a national strategy, and they were right. But subsequent to that, we worked with the President of the United States to create the commission, the President's Commission on Financial Literacy, who did begin to think about, all right, so we have some examples of things that work. How do we then create a strategy for the entire nation? How do we bring key partners together? The public sector, the nonprofit sector, private sector. How do we find those special moments in people's lives when we can make a difference and influence their behaviors? It's not enough to give people information. They've got to actually own it and change the way they behave. And you've got to find opportunities every single day in every aspect of life. There are potential partners for this process: universities, employers, churches, schools, neighbors and friends. Lots of opportunities to create teachable moments where people say, ah, now I understand it. Now I can relate to it. If I want to buy a house, then this is how I do it. If I want to pay for college education, this is how I prepare. If I want my children to do better than I did, this is what I need to do. If I don't want to be a burden on my children, which is more inspiring than, a golden opportunity in retirement, this is how I would do it. You need to use the buzzwords that really begin to resonate with people you're talking to. You also need to offer financial services in a way that is much friendlier, receiving or receptive of their influences, their practices, their customs. So we had a couple of great examples at Treasury that I thought really illustrated the point. We did a study of some of these practices down on the border in some of these communities near Mexico, between the United States and Mexico in that area. And there were some, just some phenomenal things that people tried that were just incredibly successful. One of them was banking institutions saying, okay, if I want to try to bring in clients that don't typically come in, maybe I should add some tellers that speak Spanish. Maybe I should have a kids' corner, because I notice when those families come in, they bring all their children, and the children need something to do, and I want them to feel like their families are welcome. Otherwise, they may not walk in the door. I love this one financial institution that said, I'm going to try something entirely different. I am going to offer a $1,000 short-term loan, no credit check necessary, as long as you agree to come in and let me talk to you and examine your financial situation and give you a financial literacy lesson. They had a lot of takers, and guess what they found out? That a lot of these families had good payment history, good credit history, but didn't have access to anything other than payday lenders. That they had very expensive car loans because they didn't have access to very good credit options, and that this banking institution could now refinance those loans for a much lower rate of interest immediately, just by teaching them a little bit about how it's done and being creative at looking at what was happening in their lives. So it's amazing what you can do if you go the extra mile and start to understand your client a little better. Actually look with them together at what's happening in their lives. Ask them a little bit about what their goals are. Try to understand it from their perspective, and then help plan with them together to achieve those goals. See, people just want to be respected, understood. If you do that, then they're going to listen. They're going to come in and they're going to change those behaviors, and they're going to thank you for helping them achieve those dreams, those goals. So I said, from a family that didn't have anything. I mean, we lost a couple homes along the way. We did buy homes, but immediately they were foreclosed on because my father couldn't keep up with the payments. And probably the best illustration of how difficult it was growing up was that my father, who didn't live long enough to see me become Treasurer of the United States, I wish he had, did visit me in Washington when I was working in the United States Senate. And one of the things that he loved most, his treasure that he took back to California after visiting me, was one of those uncut sheets of 32 notes. Have you seen that money? A page full of money before they chop it up into all the little bills? He bought that, and he was so excited. He went to that tour. He loved it. He was thrilled. He went home. He had a frame for it. He put it on the wall. He was just tickled. And the first time he ran out of cash, one of the rows disappeared. The next time he ran out of cash, he went across the top. You get the story, right? Eventually there was $1 sitting in the middle of a frame that was about this size. That's what happens when you don't have access to financial services, information about how to manage your resources, or the ability to really make sound decisions on a daily basis. that impact generations to come. So I want to thank all of you, because I know you're involved in this journey, basically, because that's what it is, from different points of view. Some of you as students who are learning to go out and serve the world, some of you as professionals who give advice, some of you as teachers and professors, some of you as just interested individuals, but I thank you from the bottom of my heart, because I think the work that you're doing, that you're involved in, will make a difference not just to the person you're sitting across from. It makes a difference to all of us in the room who benefit when we're all capable of accessing services and knowing how to make them work for us. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions, Brock? She's willing to take some questions.
I have to. You want to know what the difference is between a penny and a nickel, or? I love to do this. If not, I'll be here for a few, oh, yes, sir.
What's your current position?
I work for the Inter-American Development Bank. It's a long title, right? But essentially, how many of you have heard of the World Bank? Everybody's heard of it, right? But not necessarily, we don't all necessarily know what they do, right? So the Inter-American Development Bank is a regional development bank that lends in Latin America to 26 different countries. It's a public institution. It's an international public institution. The United States is the largest shareholder in the institution. We have 30% share. And for most major decisions, there's a veto set at 25%, so we have the veto power. No other shareholder has it. And what we lend for are a variety of projects. It can be a new port for ships to arrive so that products can go in and out. It can be a dam so that we, create a much more robust electrical grid. Or it can be healthcare or schools, so a variety of projects, very small, very large, mostly to public institutions, but we do about 15% of our lending to private institutions or private investors who are looking to create opportunities as well. Anything else? Yes? I forgot to tell you that. He picked that school. He's really smart. I had no clue where I was going to go. I had never studied the University of California. I had a grandmother who was living in San Jose. And he knew that at some point I would feel overwhelmed, and I would pick up the phone and look for support. And it shouldn't be my father. It should be somebody like my grandmother who lived close enough. And the reason he said that was because the one and only time I called my father and crying in the middle of the day, like, Dad, I just don't know if I can do this. He said, Mija, come home. And I knew the second I heard it was the wrong thing to have done, because I didn't really want to come home. I just wanted somebody to tell me you can do it. But he didn't know how else to react. So that's why I ended up going to Santa Cruz. But I transferred to Davis because I met my husband, who was a law student there, and he convinced me to go to Davis, so I finished there. Yes, sir?
Well, in your current position, I wonder if you'd want to speak to one of the things that was said earlier about the emerging markets and so forth, maybe about what you would say about the markets that you're working with in maybe Central and South America.
I heard Julie mention that, and I think she's right on the money, basically saying there is great opportunity. You need to be careful. There is a lot of political risk there, but it is, I think, they're growing, and especially in Latin America. They're much healthier economies than we've seen in the past, and there is tremendous opportunity there. So I would encourage you to look at it, study it, and see what's possible. There are a lot of great investment happening. I'll tell you, the Chinese are all over it. They really are. Yes, sir?
I'm just curious, what was your dream while you were in college?
I'm sorry?
I'm just curious, what was your dream while you were in college?
What was my dream while I was in college? I originally thought I didn't really have a dream. I mean, I was kind of like just led there and sort of dropped off. And so when I started to study, I thought I might want to be a lawyer. And I thought also about international relations, things that sounded like sexy topics that I didn't really know much about. I ended up going to Harvard on a fluke. I ended up applying thinking I'll never get in, and I got in. And my husband, who was wonderful, who had a law practice at the time, sold it so that we could move across the country. And he was willing to, let me borrow to go there. I mean, that's when I had $100,000 in debt. He and I both ended up getting degrees there. But I ended up not going to law school until my youngest son went to the university. And it was because when I was doing this joint degree with Harvard and the law school, I realized that school was very demanding. And so I had a pre-teenage daughter who just needed lots more time. And I decided I had to focus and split the degrees, and that I would eventually go back to law. And I didn't. I never did. So when my youngest went off to college, I decided to make that dream come true. So I actually went to college while I was, just before becoming Treasurer of the United States, and for the entire time I was Treasurer of the United States. So it's never too late. That's the message there, right? It's never too late. Yes, ma'am.
I was just curious if any of your siblings had the opportunity to go to college.
They did not go to four-year institutions, but they did all get post-high school learning. One became a medical assistant, one became a dental assistant, another also became a medical assistant, and my brother went off to the Army and then learned all sorts of trade and now is a small businessman. He owns his own firm and he remodels. So he's remade himself many times over as well. Yes, sir.
Is there any particular former treasurer of the United States that you admire or have studied or have any thoughts about in terms of how your tenure was?
No, there is a gentleman whose name I cannot recall, whose picture I hung on the wall because he was the last treasurer before the first female came in. And it was the last time they did a portrait of a treasurer. So for some of you who may not know this, Treasury has a custom of painting a portrait, just like the president does, right? Painting a portrait of the Secretary of the Treasury. And they hang on the corridors of the third floor. And you usually don't get your portrait until after you leave. Well, at one point, the Treasurer of the United States also, because it was such an important position, had a custom of having their portraits done and then hanging them. And his portrait was the only one I found really curious because, oddly enough, when there was a first woman named, they never did her portrait. And there have been no portraits since. Interesting. So I think that there have been phenomenal people who served in the position, but not one that I would say, stands out for me. It's on all the currency that was made, not only between 2004 and 2009 when I left, but also continuing after that for some time. Because what happens, and people don't really realize this, is that it takes several months to a year before a new treasurer or a new secretary signature gets on the money. It takes a long time. It's a very complicated process. So even though there were new treasurers and new secretaries appointed when President Obama took over, it took more than a year before the money actually converted over.
Well, you know the saying, cloak and dagger.
Yes.
From Alexander Hamilton.
Yes. Alexander Hamilton is by far one of my heroes. I don't know if you've read the Chernow book. How many of you have had a chance? It's like about 800 pages long, but I commend it to you. It's a fascinating book. I love that guy. He was brilliant. I don't think people realize how brilliant he was. But what I think even was more surprising to me that most people don't understand is he's actually an immigrant to the United States. Came from the West Indies. He was very poor. Came to the U.S. on a scholarship. He came from an illegitimate family. He didn't have a father, didn't have a name, didn't have the credentials that typically individuals have among the founding fathers. But he created all of the things that we rely on every single day as the first Treasury Secretary of the United States. He was amazing. He created our coin and currency system, our customs system, our tax system, everything you could possibly imagine, and he did it brilliantly. He had a lot of personal tragedies. It's unfortunate, but I commend you to read the book. You'll never look at money or the Treasury Department in the same way again. Yes, sir.
So if I take this bill out of circulation and hang it on my wall, can you autograph it?
I can. One of the things I looked into right away was whether or not my signature, because people ask you to sign money all the time, is actually considered defacing the currency. You don't want to get in trouble legally. And apparently, as long as you don't do anything that causes the money to devalue, it's not defacing currency. So I can actually sign it. Can't guarantee you it'll actually appreciate, but I can do that. Yes, sir.
I'm curious about how you came into the radar of the Bush administration before you were appointed. Did you have a relationship with him or know him before he was elected, or how did that all come about?
Yes, but not to the extent that you would imagine. I participated in a number of venues where he invited people to come in and share their thoughts about issues. And I came to a couple of those events. I was a supporter politically, and he actually had presented me with the proposal of taking the position a year earlier, and I said no. Very difficult to do. I actually said no to 3 offers they gave me. Very, very bad thing to do. And basically at one point they said, you got to stop doing this because we're not going to come back at you anymore. But they actually asked me if I would take the treasurer position, and I said no, but I know a number of other people that you can interview, and I'll give you a long list of names. And so they interviewed all those people, and a year later they came back and said, we haven't found anybody, and we really want you. And so I said, okay, a year later I think I'd be ready to do this. But it was fun. Yes, sir.
With the President's Commission, obviously there was a report that was issued, which I read. Why does nothing seem to have happened?
Are you talking about the Bush administration? It's President, so the commission it was created in the last year of the administration. And it actually did outline a plan, a strategy that focused around 4 goals. One is we need more data and research about where to move. You shouldn't be making decisions about a direction or a strategy without some hard data. 2, you need to find those moments, as I was talking about, those teachable moments in people's lives, and you need to expand the list of partners you're working with. The list goes on and on. Then what happened was we had a change in administration, we had a new commission appointed, and they've been building on that groundwork since. So you're seeing constant, minimal progress in that direction. I think there's still a lot of work to be done. For example, we should be working at having each of the 50 states require a minimum level of skills to graduate from high school so that our young people have that set before they go on to college. I frankly think that universities should require, maybe in the first year of, first term, a similar course that says this is what's going to happen over the course of your lifetime, and you got to pass this course like your other basic requirements in order to get a degree from this institution. So there's much more that can be done. I know it's frustrating. Policy turn to action always does take a little bit of time, but I think they actually are making tremendous progress, and I'm seeing it all the time. I think there are challenges. I mean, it's not an easy thing to tackle, and just like education is not easy to tackle because the federal government doesn't have a huge role. I don't know if most people know this, but the federal government's influence on education across the states is very minimal. When I was up on the Hill, 3% of all education dollars spent across the country came from the federal government. 97% of the dollars and therefore decisions got made at the local level. Same is true around financial education, no different. The challenge is great. Yes, ma'am.
You remember several times about your husband. My question is, how did you find your wife from an amazing husband?
I'm sorry, I'm hard of hearing. So, did somebody
Find your amazing and wonderful husband.
How did I find my friend? Yeah, I was so lucky. He found me. Thank you again. It's really been a pleasure to be here with you.
Well, that concludes the program for today. I thank you guys for coming, and the gals for coming too. And I know that's unpolitically correct to say gals, so men and women for coming today. We're going to probably try to do this again next year, about the same time. If you've got any little tickets to demonstrate that you were here for CE credit as CFPs, make sure Amy gets them back. Amy's back here by this wall divider. Hopefully you've turned them in before. If you forgot, your friends forgot, have them mail them to me. I'm sure they were here. We'll see you guys next year. How's that sound? Take care. Bye-bye.